Okay, now we're into the advanced node tree. We're finally nearing the end of user training within Resolve. It won't be long now before there's just some professional practice and technical setup to go, and then we'll be done. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We still have some tools to go. To that end, let's cover the only node type we've yet to use, the splitter combiner node. The splitter combiner node lets us take the color channels that make up our image and split them up so that we can work on each channel separately within a dedicated corrector node, then reassemble those channels, including any adjustments that we've made. Now, this may sound like a fiddly thing to do, but it does have its uses, especially for things like layer mixers and noise reduction or blur sharpen with greater accuracy. So I've got an image from the Shadow vs Everyone project here, and I'm going to set up a splitter combiner node tree structure. That's easy to do, it's just Alt and Y. Now here we see the basic RGB splitter setup. The leftmost node is the splitter. It's splitting our image up into its three constituent channels, in this case red, green and blue. And the rightmost node is the combiner. It's collapsing those channels back into each other again and producing a full RGB image. As long as we don't do anything to the middle three nodes, nothing is going to happen. But if I make a change in the red channel, let's say if I increase the gain in the red channel, you can see that if I increase the values in the red channel, then the image goes red, because the red channel then has a higher set of values than the other two channels, thereby producing a red color cast. Now this still might not seem that useful, and in truth it's not very commonly used during most grading jobs, but it does have some cool features that can help out under the right circumstances. Now, my favourite use of this is something I learned whilst shadowing another colourist at Prime Focus in London quite a few years ago now. He showed me that you can get a better starting point for a bleach bypass grade if you extracted the green channel from your image and then used that for your silver layer instead of a standard desaturated version of the image. Now to do this, I've got my default splitter set up, and I need to of course make a layer mixer as well, so just give me a second whilst I do that. What we've got here is an image that's been split up into its three channels, but we have a serial node that contains our green channel represented as a black and white image, and when looking at the splitter node you will notice there are three coloured dots, a red, a green and a blue at the top, middle and bottom. This corresponds to which corrector node contains which channel. So the top node contains the red channel, the middle node contains the green channel, and the bottom node contains the blue channel. I'm going to take our green channel represented as a black and white image, and I'm going to use that as our silver layer in the composite in the layer mixer. Now, there are two reasons for doing this. A, any camera that uses a Bayer pattern color filter array, and remember that one from the red module, will have twice as much green as either red or blue. And this particular image was shot with an Arri Alexa Mini, so it's definitely a Bayer pattern CFA. This means we have more contrast to work with, and the overlay isn't going to make our image as dark as the other two channels. And B, skin tones. Skin tones appear closer to 50% grey when viewed in the green channel in black and white. And remember that 50% grey has no effect in an overlay blend mode. This means we'll automatically do a better job of preserving skin tones whilst making a bleach bypass this way. Now I want the silver layer to be on the top of the layer stack, so remember, I need to connect that into the bottom input on my layer mixer. Now, we can treat this just like any other bleach bypass. I can go in, I can change my key output to scale it in, and there we go. We now have a fairly passable bleach bypass. So this is a really neat trick for the splitter combiner node. If you're up against the clock, then doing this for a bleach bypass can save you a little bit of time. It's just Alt-Y, then Alt-S, then Alt-L. That will make you a splitter node, a serial corrector and a layer mixer, and then you just need to plug your green channel into the bottom of your mixer node, and away you go. Just go ahead, change the key output, and there you go. It's quite a nice trick. I use it every now and again. I always like to put more detailed work into things when I have the time, but there have been one or two projects where I've just had to rush an effect out, and this is a very good way of producing a much better result much more quickly. So that was the first cool use of this, and we'll go through some other uses before we move on. So I'm going to get rid of my layer mixer here. Now there are other things we can do with these individual channels. For example, if I go into node sizing in my pan and scan options and change the zoom setting of the individual channel, you can see I can set up a crazy kind of chromatic aberration effect. I can even apply blur and sharpen to individual channels. Now, that's kind of a fun, funky effect, but it's really quite niche, and I've never actually used it in a real project because I've never had to produce a fake chromatic aberration like that during a grade. It's kind of a novelty thing, but it's there. Far more important is that we can use the splitter node to be more accurate with our noise reduction. Now, I'll tell you a secret about the blue channel. The blue channel has more noise hiding away in there than either of the other two channels. And the explanation for this can get pretty tech-heavy, but it's a combination of things. First, we have an image shot with a Bayer pattern filter, so twice as much green as red or blue. So the red and blue channels are at a disadvantage anyway. And also, a lot of current sensor technology has a tendency to be less sensitive to blue light. Now, as you might guess, we're going to use a splitter node to isolate the blue channel, and then we're simply going to apply our noise reduction to the node containing the blue channel at the bottom of this kind of stack of 3 down here. I can go ahead. I can add my standard noise reduction, and this does a better job at preserving image detail while still addressing noise that can be present in the image. Right, this has been a good introduction to the splitter and combiner nodes. If these seem a little high concept, then don't worry, it's not very common for us to make use of them. They're really more of a specific niche thing, and I tend to use them mostly for the bleach bypass trick or for containing noise reduction to individual channels. That being said, practicing with everything is going to make you a better colorist, so have a go and then click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. Okay. Node trees can get a little wild, right? I mean, look at this one. So we're going to take a look at a really powerful way to keep everything under control. Much like we can nest clips or sequences in Premiere Pro or pre-compose in After Effects, we can also collapse multiple nodes down into a single node that contains all the separate components that went into it. This is called a compound node, and it's a lot like a nested clip, but for nodes in our node tree. We'll go through how compound nodes work. So here, you can see a fairly typical node tree for a drama grade. This is beginning to get a little gnarly, so what we can do is we can use a compound node in order to make this node tree easier to organize. Now, we've covered parallel nodes and layer mixer nodes before, and how they help us keep organized. And because they are a number of nodes grouped together based on a particular goal or function, they are the first and most logical candidates for becoming compound nodes. I've got a cluster of nodes here which are concerned with the bleach bypass effect. I'm going to place all the nodes concerned with this goal into the same compound node. I do that by selecting all the relevant nodes, which in this case is just a click and drag. And now I can right-click any one of the selected nodes and choose Create Compound Node from the bottom of the drop-down menu. Now all the selected nodes vanish and are replaced by a node that looks like a few playing cards stacked on top of each other. See the 3 separate upper borders up here. This is how you identify a compound node. Now this compound node contains all of the previously selected nodes, and because of that, anything I do to this node, such as repositioning it in the node tree, changing its key output, etc., happens to all the nodes contained within. This can make organizing my node tree much easier, and it can open up some truly mind-bending possibilities with the layer mixer nodes. Now, this is cool, but you might be wondering, I still have work to do. Won't I just do this right at the end, and in which case, what is the point? By then all the work's done anyway. Wouldn't it be better if I could edit the contents of a compound node or even copy them to other node trees? Well, there's good news. Editing the contents of a compound node is dead simple. You simply hold either Control for Windows or Command for Mac and double left-click the compound node. This will take us inside, and we will see the contents of the compound node in our node tree. For those with experience of Premiere Pro or After Effects, this is just like going into a nested clip or a pre-composition. We can work on any of our nodes in here, and it will update our grade in real time, just like normal. Once we're done in here, we can click on the little white compound node down here, and that will take us back to the top level of our node tree for this shot. Compound nodes can contain other compound nodes, and if you find you're getting a bit lost, you have a convenient flowchart down here showing you where you are in your node tree. Because of this, it can certainly be helpful to change the node label and rename your compound nodes. So if we want to copy a compound node into another node tree, all we need to do is grab a still or right-click on that shot's thumbnail. So I'm going to take a still, I'm going to make myself a new album, and I'm going to take a still. And if I want to then move that compound node onto a different shot, I just need to display the node graph, and I can literally drag and drop the entire compound node into the node tree and it will have its full effect. And then I can double click and go into that as well and change it up for that shot. Now, at the time this video was recorded, we cannot yet save compound nodes as shared nodes. I certainly think that would be a great and powerful feature, but it's not quite there yet. Now, we're almost there, just 2 more things to go, and then we're done with this one. First, we can also grade a compound node, and this is essentially like working on a corrector node that just sits at the end of the compound node's internal node tree. It will happen after everything else in the compound node, so I can just get my primary wheels and just do whatever, and it will then just sit on top of that correction. It can be useful in some cases, but I find it quite easy to forget about what you've done on a compound node itself, and for this reason, unless I'm using a qualification to target a compound node's effects, I like to leave the compound node's color settings untouched if I can help it. And finally, we need to know how to take a step backwards. What if we collapse too many nodes or we change our mind? Well, breaking up a compound node is dead easy. We simply right-click on the node and choose Decompose Compound Node. This will erase the compound node and restore every node it contains in the correct order, retaining whatever settings they had at the time the node was decomposed. So we will not lose any work, we will not lose anything by doing this. So this was a good introduction to compound nodes. They really are one of the more advanced features in Resolve, so have a play around and see what you can do. They can be particularly fun when combined with layer mixer nodes, so see what you can do there. And click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. Now we're going to take a look at the Open Effects plugins that come shipped with Resolve. Now this is one of the few lectures that covers some paid license features of Resolve, so if you're on the free version, feel free to skip this for now. Open Effects are visual effects plugins that can be installed and used within Resolve by adding different OFX plugins to corrector nodes in our node tree. With these effects, we can do things like generate lens flares, set up composites and add film grain, as well as make a number of color space and gamut transforms that can be helpful for higher-end broadcast work. Throughout this and the next few lectures we will be covering some of the more useful effects. Don't be limited to these though. Play around and experiment on your own to see what you can do. We're going to start with an overview of how the Open effects work and then take a look at some of the most basic effects, the blur category. Effects can be applied to any corrector node we have in our node tree, or they can be added to our node tree as nodes of their own. What you choose to do depends on what you hope to accomplish. Generally speaking, I like to give most effects their own node unless they are something super basic like a blur. In order to apply an effects plugin to a node on the node tree, we first have to bring up the effects gallery, and we do this by clicking on the effects icon in the upper right up here. Now we can see a full list of all the effects that have been installed. Resolve supports the Open Effects format, so that means plugins from the likes of Boris Effects can be installed directly into Resolve, providing they claim that Resolve is a valid host application. Now we can take a look through the first effects category, the blurs, and these are the simplest effects to use within Resolve, and they have their uses. I don't use these very often, but we'll take a look at how to apply and edit effects using them as they are an easy starting point. I'm going to add the first effects plugin to a pre-existing node, and then we'll go over the other method. To do this, I'm just going to drag and drop the Gaussian blur effect onto my last empty corrector node, and that will apply the effect to that particular node. Now we have an effects plugin active, and we can see the effects badge on the node, this little FX in a white circle down here. Before we move on, if we decide that we want to remove a plugin from a node, what we need to do is right-click and choose Remove OFX Plugin. Now we have an effects plugin applied to a node, and we can go about changing the controls up here in order to refine the blur. I've got the horizontal and vertical blur. Now this can be used to make a more sophisticated blur effect than the standard blur and sharpen tools we've seen before, but it's a fairly basic effect by itself. What's worth taking account of, though, is that most effects plugins respect any form of qualification that may be present on their node. So if I use a circular power window, and set it up like so, I can actually make a blurred vignette to my shot fairly easily. I can then click and drag these sliders to change the amount of blur I've got. I've got a black border at the moment, so on border type I can just choose replicate, and that will basically fill in any detail on the outside if we get a black border. If I uncheck gang, I can change horizontal and vertical blur independently and make a more kind of stylized looking vignette, should I choose. It's quite a bit more powerful than the standard RGB blur we had before. And at the bottom we have global blend. Global blend basically fades the whole effect in and out. The higher global blend is, the less effect our effect is going to have, basically. When it reaches 1, it's invisible. When it reaches 0, the full effect of the OFX plugin is visible. So I can then drag this up just to tweak this out a little bit. There we go. And then I've got a nice kind of blurred vignette on this image here. Now, using secondaries with effects is key to using some of the more sophisticated effects we have, because otherwise they can be kind of blunt instruments, like they'll blur and sharpen the whole image, typically not what we want. So we have to keep in mind that we use most effects in conjunction with secondary keys or our power windows. Now, we have some other blur effects here. We have things like radial blur, which will make the image look as though it's spinning. We have a zoom blur, makes the image look like it's being zoomed in. And it's worth noting that we can only have a single OFX plugin on a node. If I drag another blur on, if I go back to directional blur will let me blur and then choose the angle of that blur as well. If I put another effect on top, it's going to erase the old one, so I do need to have separate nodes for different effects, and then of course I can use a compound node to collapse them all into each other and make them that much easier to handle. When I say I tend to give most OFX their own node, that means I make an empty corrector and put the OFX on that node as opposed to just dragging them onto the timeline. So this has been a good introduction to the Resolve Effects and OpenFX plugins. We're going to take a much more in-depth look at some of the more advanced and useful effects over the next few lectures, so click on through once you're ready. Right, so on to another important and useful effects plugin. The Face Refiner, and that sounds a little Soylent Green to me, is a tool that helps to automate the tasks commonly carried out on the faces on any on-screen talent. So things like vignettes, skin tone work, eye vignetting, etc. It can be useful, though it still has a few rough edges to be aware of. Now, this lecture is going to be a two-parter because working with faces is extremely important, and there's some new colour theory I need to share with you when performing some high-end beauty work. So, here we're back in the PC01 project. This is one of our contributors from way back, and we're going to use the Face Refiner in order to make some more sophisticated refinements to this contributor's face. Now, first, drag the Face Refiner onto our node tree, and then we need to hit the Analyze button. So I'm just going to drag the Face Refiner effect onto an empty corrector node. There we go. And the first thing I need to do is hit the Analyze button up here. That's going to carry out the tracking for the face mask automatically. So I'm just going to left-click this, and you can see it doing its thing. Now, he looks a little bit like the master control program right now, so I'm just going to go down here and I'm going to click off. And that stops the kind of blue-green interface from interfering with my work. Now, this has been improved since version 15, but I still find that it can struggle on faces turned 3/4 and in profile, so pick your fights with this one. That's not to say never use it if the talent isn't directly facing the screen, just don't expect miracles in every shot. So, let's take a look at some of the options we have here. First, we have the skin mask options, and these let us refine the qualification drawn to isolate the skin tones of the Face Refiner has identified. So first, we have Use Mask and Use Face Mask. Use Mask tells Resolve to make a secondary qualification similar to the HSL that we can then use to constrain the adjustments we're making within the Face Refiner. In most cases, we want this on. And we then have the Use Face Mask option. Because this is a fairly standard HSL key, we can of course get things that we don't want to work falling within the qualification. What the Use Face Mask checkbox does is place a circular power window around the tracked face automatically. Now, does all of this sound familiar? It's essentially an automation of what we would normally do with secondary keys and power windows across multiple nodes, all folded into one. Also, down here we have the Show Mask checkbox, and this will actually show us the mask we have for the face. Now, you can see that I'm shaving off the right-hand side of his cheek here, so I'm going to use Face Mask Size Up until I start to get all of the face, and then I'm going to up the softness a little bit, and I might tweak the Refine Mask just to get rid of some of the black holes here. So the Face Mask slider increases the size of the circular power window, softness is just the feather, and Refine Mask basically carries out some clean black and clean white operations on the HSL key we've got. So I'm just going to do that until I'm more or less happy. I'm going to take face mask down very slightly so I avoid this weird little white scrap we have kind of on his lapel down here. We don't want that. So I'm just going to bring that back in, and there, that's a pretty good face mask for the face refiner on this shot. Now that I'm done with this, I just uncheck show mask, and we can start the actual work. So, the next thing we have are the texture controls, and this allows us to smooth out blemishes in the skin. We also have an accompanying slider that reads amount and scale. These allow us to choose to preserve some skin details by defining the size of the details we preserve and how much they are preserved. We use a combination of these two sliders to achieve a desirable but also natural and convincing look. Now, I'm going to leave this as it is because I've got a separate lecture specifically on the subject of beauty work and the beauty effect, which has many of the same controls and a more advanced beauty function that you can access through the operating mode drop-down menu. So, just to reiterate, we're not going to do anything with the texture controls in this one. We're going to do a whole lecture on skin beauty work later on, and we'll use a much better dedicated beauty effect for that, not the face refiner. Now next, we have the color grading controls for the face refiner. Once we've set the skin smoothness and detail using the above sliders, we can then move on to more nuanced work on the skin tones. First we have contrast, and this obviously increases the contrast within the mask. I'm going to put that up until I'm happy, but I don't want the shadows to be too harsh, so about there. I don't want the right hand side of his eye there to look too dramatic. So that's just about right for me there, maybe just a little bit less. Then we have the mid-tone slider, and this will add a slight push to the mids, which is unsurprising. If you're a bit reckless with this, it can lead to a kind of weird glowing effect, which in most cases we don't want. So I'm actually going to bring my mids down a little bit. There we go. And just get that nice kind of contrast there. After that, we have tint, and this lets us push the skin tones towards red or orange or even magenta in some cases. It's a nice little touch to try and nudge the overall skin tones closer to where they need to be. Now he's looking a bit yellow, so what I can do is I can shift the tint over slightly. So if I go back, he's green. If I go that way, he's a bit magenta. What I can do is I can shift his skin tones. And tell you what, make it easier on myself, I'm going to bring up the vector scope. And you can see how that has an impact on that reading there. So I'm just going to bring it down until it's more on the eye line. There we go. That's looking like a better, kind of healthier, redder skin tone to me. Now we have color boost, and this is very similar to a saturation setting. I might just boost the color ever so slightly. I don't want to be too harsh with this one because it can appear to glow, and we don't want glowing skin tones. Maybe I'll just take my tint back down a little bit more. Okay, there we go, that's better. That's better for it there. Okay, so next we have the desaturate shadows slider. Now, remember how we get that odd glowing quality in some of the troublesome shadows, especially on foliage and skin? Desaturate shadows is a great shortcut to dealing with that when working on faces. We mostly see the effect on this in the shadows around the chin and in the place where the jaw seems to meet the neck. So I'm just going to play around with desaturate shadows. And the shadow in his right eye is looking a little bit colourful. So I can just bring that down ever so slightly, like not too much. There we go. And that's a pretty good place for his skin to be in. And finally, we have shine removal, which, as the name implies, dulls down the shine on the face we're working on by pulling down highlights and making them more similar to the values surrounding them. This is good if we have problems with blown out or particularly shiny faces, let's say if it's a hot day on shoot or there's some awkward natural lighting to deal with. So I'm now going to play around with shine removal, and if I drag it up you can see that it kind of brings those highlights on his face down and we get kind of a matte look. Or I can inversely bring it down and I can actually exaggerate the model on his face by increasing those highlights. That looks a little bit kind of shiny plastic to me. I think by default, the exposure on his face is looking pretty good. I might actually be tempted just to drag it down slightly and get a little bit more detail out of those highlights. Ever so slightly, just to kind of accentuate the model here. Now, the other way I would do this is just to pull a secondary on the highlights on the face and then do it that way, but this is much easier. I get less control, because I can't really define what a highlight is within the mask, but I quite like that. So I'm going to take a before and after look at this. And that's nice. I definitely think that's an improvement. There are still a few little issues here or there. His skin is all the same colour, and in the next lecture we're going to talk about that a bit more. But for now, this is a good first pass on our face refiner. So this was pretty quick, so take your time and play around with the sliders. Try and get a feel for the impact we'll have. We're going to call it here for this lecture, and we'll continue with the advanced controls in the next one. So click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. Right, back again, and this time we're going to finish it. Let's go over the advanced controls for the face refiner. Now, before we move on to the really advanced stuff, we'll go over the eye retouching controls. The eyes are, of course, super important, as they are the most expressive part of a human face and therefore play the largest role in our emotional connection with the on-screen talent. The eye retouching controls work only within the regions of the face that the face refiner has defined as the eyes, which should not surprise anyone. If we want to look at what the face refiner has identified as the eyes, what we need to do is go into our drop-down menu on our program viewer down here and choose the Open Effects Overlay option, and here we can clearly see the eye masks created, and they look pretty good for the most part. Then we'll go back to off so that it doesn't get in the way when we're judging the grade that we've done. And I'll zoom in a bit on the eyes as well. I want to be able to see these. We've got 4 controls here, and they are mostly self-explanatory. Sharpening does just that. It will sharpen the eyes within the eye window, created by the face refiner. Brightening brightens the inner eyes up. Now be careful with both of these. Less is more, especially with the brightening effect. In the older version of the face refiner, the brightening effect had the unfortunate side effect of making the eye windows created by the face refiner rather obvious. The track wasn't great, and they used to kind of judder and dance around a bit, which meant that I didn't used to use the face refiner a great deal once it was introduced. It's improved a great deal now, and if I drag up the brightening slider, you can see what I mean. If I just play this on a loop with brightening turned up to max, you can begin to see down there little bits of juddering, little bits of kind of dancing around where the track's not great. So just be very careful when using the brightening setting on the face refiner. It cannot be too high because it will give you away. I'm going to say about 0.3 is okay here. And I might turn up the sharpen by 0.1. Next is the eye light. This effect works in an eye mask shape around the eyes themselves and has the effect of either brightening or darkening the areas immediately around the eyes. It can be useful if the face hasn't been lit too well, or it can be used to add a bit of extra drama in certain cases as well. So if I drag the eye light up, you'll see there's kind of like a bandit's mask shape around his eyes, like kind of a Lone Ranger mask, and we're working within that, and I can choose to either brighten it up, or I can actually darken it down and add a bit more shadow to his eyes as well. Now I don't want to lose his right eye in shadow completely, so I'm going to bring my eye light up ever so slightly, maybe about 0.25. And if I start to take a look, we can see the effect that's had. Now I think the sharpening's a little bit aggressive there, so I'm going to take the sharpening down to about 0.04. There we go. I'm just going to play this now, take a look. What I don't want is eye windows being too obvious. When I zoom out a little bit. Okay, those look good to me. Always use a light touch with the eye controls because the tracking on the eyes is not perfect. Now, finally, we have eye bag removal, and this is exactly what it sounds like, and it helps us reduce the appearance of bags under the talent's eyes. A light touch is best here, but it can be very useful to make a contributor look a little bit more youthful, and believe me, corporate types are very keen on maintaining appearances. Make a small tweak here now, and we can see the effect it has. Now, I don't want it to be kind of 100, because that's a bit much, but I can go up to about 0.35, 0.4 here, and there you can see the effect that's had. I'm just going to make that play. I might turn bag removal down to about 0.3 or 0.33. And we can see in particular the eye bags are now far less obvious, but we don't have a very obvious artificial section. Let's just turn it down a little bit. But we don't have a kind of super obvious section here that we've worked on, which is very important. So I'm quite happy with the effect that's had. Just making sure the skin key was good. Thought I spotted a secondary error here, but that's absolutely fine. And there we go. That's the eye bags removed there. So this is our kind of eye retouching pass. And if we play through, I do think that's quite a nice improvement. It frustrates me that we cannot toggle off and on by category down here. We just have to turn the entire node off and on. So it's difficult to tell exactly what we've done with just the eyes because it's also folded into the overall face grade. In future versions of Resolve, I do hope to see a kind of categorized turn on, turn off button down here, kind of toggle off and on, so we can more easily appraise the work that we've done. Now, before we move on, I need to talk to you about some quite important color theory to understand regarding idealized depictions of the human face in portraiture. So give me a second. And I've got something here that looks really weird, but it actually makes perfect sense. So, the face is not all the same color. Remember when I told you not to use the color compressor inside a skin key? This is why. We have a natural variation of hues all over the human body, and this depends on factors like blood vessels being close to the skin, subcutaneous fat, veins, all kinds of things. If we see someone who is made to look entirely the same color, then the effect is unnatural. Now, the face is particularly important. It's a key feature we use to identify a person's emotional state, and it's what helps us make the strongest, most immediate connections to a performance. So you can imagine we might spend a little bit of extra time getting the talent's face just so. Now, up until this point, we've been doing only very basic beauty work. We've warmed up the skin, increased the saturation, but we haven't really done anything super intensive. To do just that, we must understand the following. There are 3 zones on the human face in portraiture, and each has a bias towards a particular color. As you can see here, I've made corrections here with the linear window just to illustrate what I'm talking about. So we'll start off with the first color region of the face. The forehead is more yellow or white. We then have the cheeks, and these are always more red or orange. And we then have the chin, which is typically more blue or green or possibly a kind of greyish cyan colour. Maintaining these general trends in colour will produce a more natural and pleasing looking rendition of a human face. Now, that is not to say that these colour biases are super obvious all the time. You never want a face to look like this kind of Neapolitan ice cream thing I've got going on here, okay? This is just to illustrate that we have 3 separate colour sections on a face when we work on a face. In reality, it's going to be far more subtle, and we'll go over how we do that with the face refiner in a second. Now, it might sound pretty difficult to split the face up into these 3 regions manually. You'd have to do 3 separate power curves all tracked and rotoscoped, but we don't have to, because, going back to my previous version, the face refiner does that automatically for us. If I go back to the window, it's going to draw a region above the eyebrows, between the eyebrows and the tip of the nose and the chin, and those will be its 3 main colour regions for the face. You'll notice we have controls for the eye, lip, blush, forehead, cheeks and chin already. All of these controls have the same 2 sliders plus 1 extra in some cases, and all of these controls have the hue and saturation sliders, which you also know by now will deal with hue and saturation. In this case, I'm going to ignore the lips because the lips are small here, and because I'm dealing with a male subject, I'm going to ignore blush as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go straight to cheek retouching. Down here, I've got forehead, which has a smooth option for crow's feet as well. I'll just unfurl all these 3. Now, looking at this face, I think it's probably a little bit too close towards yellow already, so I think I can leave the forehead alone in terms of hue and saturation. What I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to nudge the cheeks a little bit towards red to get a better kind of variation of hue in this face. And if I do yellow, it's green, you can see the region it's doing, and I'm just going to drag these up, and I'll maybe buff up the saturation very slightly. That's a gaming term, buff the saturation. I will increase the saturation very slightly, and here you can see how I now have a more natural variation between that kind of yellowish forehead and the cheeks which are going a little bit redder. Now I don't want them to go too pink and I don't want this to be too obvious. So I'm going to play around with it until I'm happy. And I'm quite happy for that cheek colour there, and I think the forehead looks good. With the forehead, I might just turn up the smoothing option a little bit. And the smoothing option kind of tries to hide some blemishes. We're going to go over beauty work in much more detail in another lecture, so don't worry, we can just play with this setting for the time being. But if I drag this up, it's going to start reducing the impact of crow's feet and blemishes on the forehead. And I might just say 1 is obviously far too much, 0.3 might just help out here. I might just boost up the colour. In fact, no, you know what, I'll leave the forehead alone, I think the forehead's fine. So now, remembering what our third region is, chin retouching, I typically want the chin to go closer to either blue or green. And I don't want this to be too obvious, so it's going to be quite a gentle touch here. Obviously I don't want him to like turn into an orc or whatever down here. So maybe negative 0.1 is enough. And I might actually just kill the saturation ever so slightly down here because it's natural for the chin to be a little bit more grey. And I might just... bring that down to 1.5. And again, these things are never super obvious. We're not going to have like, you know, like white forehead, bright red cheeks like Ronald McDonald. It's just a slight variation in hue, and I might just bring that down ever so slightly, maybe 1.5, 1.5. Cool, and it just helps. You see how we have a very flat, uneven, like kind of very flat and even looking skin tone there, and here we just have slightly more healthy looking complexion, maybe even like 0.1. 0.1. And it's just a very slight hue variation in the cheeks we're introducing and making a very slight variation down in the chin here, which is cool. So I've got my face exactly where I like it, and we can see before and after. I think that's quite a dramatic improvement here. Maybe the eye bags are a little bit fierce, so what I'll do is I might just take my eye bag removal down to like maybe 1.5. Or 0.15, I should say. And I might take my eye light down to 0.175. There we go, make it a little bit less obvious, and maybe bring eye brightening down to 0.2. I'm just concerned the eyes looked a little bit fake before, but now I think that looks fine. So we can see this has had quite a nice impact on the face we've got here. It's a big improvement over like the standard flat yellow skin tone we had before. We've smoothed out some blemishes on the forehead, we've improved the eyes, we've got a natural variation in hue on the forehead, the cheeks and the chin as well. So this has made a big improvement to our image, and it's actually done so in a fraction of the time it would take for me to go around and, you know, cut out the forehead, cut out the cheeks, cut out the eyes, cut out the chin. I used to have to do it that way, it took forever, and this is a much better way of doing it. So there's one last setting we're going to take a look, and then we're going to take a look at how we might finesse the mask whilst using the face refiner as well, because the default secondary and skin keys are not always the best options. But there's one last slider we're going to take a look at, and that is called Global Blend. Now the last thing I'm going to do is tweak the overall effect using the Global Blend slider. This is basically like an opacity setting for the whole face refiner effect and the visible effect that it has. The higher we set Global Blend, the more the effects of the face refiner seem to fade out until we eventually return to the original version of the face. And if I turn Blend up to 0, it will disappear. At 0.5, it will be half and half. At 0, it'll all be there. So in grading, we often push a little bit too far and then dial it back, and this is no different. I'm going to push the Global Blend up a smidge so that the effect I have is not too obvious or jarring. So I'm going to put Global Blend up to maybe 0.15. There we go, and then it's not too strong or too obvious, and now I've got a really nice, quite in-depth, very accurate and targeted grade of this face using this tool, which is much, much faster than the standard kind of, track a circular window or rotoscope a power curve options we've been using up until now. So, there are a few flaws here, chiefly being that the original skin mask and the tracked face, like the face mask, are not great by themselves. They can be okay on some shots, and other shots we need to do something else. We need to do something better. So if we want to use a mask of our own, what I have to do is I have to uncheck Use Mask. And now, whilst the face is still identifying eyes, nose, lips, forehead, cheek and chin, it's not actually targeting its corrections within a mask of any kind. But what I can do, I can actually pull a key of my own on this node, and then the effect applied to this node will only happen inside that key. So for example, I will draw a obvious triangular shape here, and you can see that the face refiner effect is only taking place within this power window. So that then gives us an answer as to how do we fix an automatic key that's a bit naff. Well, we pull our own. I can pull a key on the skin, until I'm happy with it. And then, usual trick in combination with that, I can then use a soft mask tracked to the face, and here now I have got my face refiner constrained within a mask of my own design. So you do not have to use the automatic skin mask and face mask tools if you do not want to. They are certainly useful, but we can make a more accurate mask ourselves if we want. One thing to be aware of should you choose to work this way though is that if you pull a key of your own, one thing to be aware of is that should you do it this way, you can actually, and if we look very closely, you can actually restrict the region of the eyes you're working on with the key that you pull. So in order to get this right, we'd have to do a different approach. What we would have to do, and let me just reset everything here. What I would have to do is I would have to set up a tree containing 2 nodes and also a key mixer. And I would have to pull A, a skin key, and then B, tracked windows for both eyes, and combine those two together, and then feed the combined key into the face refiner. So I'll do that just now. On this top node, I'm going to key the skin. Now that's great for the skin, not so great for the eyes, but that's okay. So now, on this bottom node, I'm going to have to quickly track the eyes. And then I'll make a second curve, and I will track these eyes. Again, being careful to make sure that they do not go outside of the face. And I will then track that. Cool. So now, you can see that I actually have a mask in this node, which does include the eyes, and now when I change the eye mask, when I change the eye grade, you'll see that I do not restrict my eye corrections using this method. Last thing to do would be to make the garbage mat for the face over here. Make sure I don't get any of that annoying red column in the background. And here, maybe I can fix that little janky bit in the eyebrow. And now when I go back here, I have an almost perfect mask for the face. I could maybe matte out this bit down here, I could improve some other things, but then here we go. I've now got my face refiner effect within a mask of my own definition and my own creation, so you do not have to use the automatic effects. So this was quite a good in-depth look at the face refining tool. We're going to be taking a closer look at what we call beauty work in the next lecture, so click on through once you're ready. So, we've worked with the face refiner, which is a great tool, but its smoothing and beauty functions might not be quite good enough, which is a good thing that we have a dedicated plugin for beauty work. This smooths out details on any given surface, typically skin, in order to give a more pleasing, idealized look on screen. Beauty is intended to work on skin, but can in fact work on anything, and by default it's going to smooth out the whole image, and I will show you what I mean. So I've got an image from the Shana vs Everyone project here, and I'm going to drag beauty onto the latest empty node, and if I drag amount and scale up, you'll see that it's actually smoothing out the entire image and not just the skin on this image. So the first thing I have to do is actually pull a qualification and then make use of the beauty effect within that qualification. So I'm just going to pull a quick key on the skin here. Can lose some of the greener, yellower stuff. And I'm really just looking to get the skin tones here, and I'm going to use a garbage matte to make sure that I keep just the face and don't get the hair and the wood over here. So Arri Alexa is great stuff, isn't it? I love working with Alexa shot stuff. Okay, fine, that's a good start, so I'm going to combine that with the garbage matte. And let's just check how this moves within the shot. So let's just check the key. Okay, we've got a little bit of chatter, so I'm going to go to closing circle radius iterations 2. Okay, so I might just bring it. There we go. Cool, so I've got a pretty good skin key there, and I can now work within this key using the beauty effect, which I've applied to this node. So, when using the beauty effect or something similar to this, we want to see the image as large as we possibly can whilst working with the effects controls. And there's a trick to doing that. If I hold Shift and hit F to make a full screen effect, if I have the settings for an effect open when I do that, I keep them open up here, so I can now see what I'm doing, but with a full screen. And with the beauty effect, it's very important that we do this because we need to be able to see something large and with a lot of detail. So now that we've got a full screen sorted, we're going to move on and take a look at the actual controls themselves. So by default, the beauty plugin is set to automatic, and this is super easy to use, and in a lot of cases it's going to be enough as well. It's pretty good. We have 3 sliders here, and the first is amount. This is a measure of how much beauty work is carried out, how much the skin is smoothed using the automatic preset. Dragging it to the right smooths the skin out, dragging it to the left performs a sharpening operation, which makes it look a bit like a zombie. We don't really want that. Next, we have scale, and this actually has an odd effect on our skin smoothing. When taken right down to 0, scale will remove the smoothing effect entirely. So I can set my smoothing amount to 1.5, my scale to 0, and nothing's going to happen. And if I take it right the way up to 1, it actually has a very diffuse effect on the image. It's not the same as an opacity setting. We have the global blend right beneath this one. Our automatic skin smoothing has the strongest effect when the scale is set to its default value of 0.5. We can get more finessed effects by increasing the scale with larger amount values. It's counterintuitive, but there we go. So let's say, for example, I've got amount that looks a little bit much, but then I can increase scale slightly to about 0.7, 0.75. And here I can toggle off, and I can toggle on, and we can see the effect that has on the skin. I might take amount down to 0.3, and scale to like 0.65. Maybe 0.4 then. And we can see the kind of skin smoothing effect that has. Now that gives us a more idealized view of the skin on this actress. It gives us a more kind of idealized image. It's not too artificial. We wouldn't know just by looking. What we don't want to do is do this kind of super smooth porcelain doll thing. That never works out well. And I've seen a few projects where too much of that has been done. I found the first few episodes of the second series of Ripper Street were a bit aggressive on the skin smoothing, personally. Now, most of the time auto is good enough, but we will want to get really in-depth at times, so we're going to cover the advanced settings as well. To do this, we're going to go to the operating mode drop-down menu here and choose advanced, and then we get all of these different settings as well. Now, the first thing to realize is that if we switch back and forth between automatic and advanced, Resolve will remember, and it will only apply the active mode. What we do not have is our advanced skin smoothing stacking on top of our automatic. Okay, so if I go back to automatic, that's still there. If I go back to advanced, it resets to 0, and then I have all of these advanced controls that I can use. So we now have a whole range of options we can use to fine-tune our beauty work. We'll start with smoothing, as this is the most basic function, and here it, unsurprisingly, smooths the qualified regions of the image out. Dragging it all the way to the right, it's going to smooth it right out. Dragging it to the left is going to do a kind of weird sharpening effect. It's one of those settings where you have a very kind of loose, light touch. You don't want to use a lot of either in either direction. Next we have diffuse lighting, and this has the effect of blurring out the skin but has a greater effect on diffusing the highlights in the qualified regions of the image. This can help us avoid sharp highlights undermining the effect of our skin moving, because regions of sharp contrast can make our skin blur look a little obvious. An interesting point here is you can actually play these two effects against each other if you're looking for a subtle effect with only a little work. Try to make diffuse lighting positive and the smoothing threshold a tiny little bit negative to see what you get. So I can sharpen slightly this way, negative 0.1, and put diffuse lighting up here, maybe negative 0.5, and the effect I get kind of smooths out the highlights on her face. Alternatively, I can put just a little bit, maybe 0.75, 0.075 of blur, which is still a lot. So, this is a good starting point for our skin. The eyes are a little bit blurry and we have features that we need to recover, and that's exactly what we're going to do with the next set of sliders. Now, the next one's actually a blast from the past for me, as I have my roots in Photoshop before I even got into film. Texture recovery uses a trick which is very similar to what an old-school Photoshop user would call a high-pass overlay. To understand what these controls do, we have to check the Preview Texture box. Now, this funky grayscale is similar to what the high-pass filter does in Photoshop. It increases the contrast locally within a series of regions within the image, and this creates the effect of a very textured and noisy looking picture. By itself, this image is useless, but when placed on top of the original with the overlay blend mode, it has the effect of sharpening the image. The texture recovery controls within the beauty effect do something similar. The texture threshold setting increases or reduces the contrast within the high-pass image, and the add texture effect then blends that with the original image in such a way that it can either enhance or reduce the perceived detail within the image. So let's take a look at this then. I've got my default texture threshold, and then I can go add texture. And you see, as I use this, skin pores and defects, well, I say defects, that's a bit harsh, blemishes start to come through the smoothing a little bit more. And you can see that I can go all the way, or I can indeed do a weird emboss edges effect here, which I've never had to do because it looks awful. But I can go in the opposite direction and blur them out a bit as well. So I'm going to add texture a little bit here, maybe 0.15, 0.2. I'm going to increase my threshold a little bit. There we go. And now you can see that I'm still maintaining some of those textual skin details here, which I want to maintain some of them. I don't want all of them to go because it'll look artificial. So using these sliders is an art of subtlety, and there shouldn't be any really obvious changes here. You're just trying to convince the viewer that the skin is natural but idealized, so we're not looking for things which are really big and brash and obvious. And finally, we have feature recovery, and feature recovery focuses on discrete features and attempts to bring them through our skin smoothing intact so that we don't get distracted by any features which are too big or detailed to be convincingly blurred out. To understand what's happening here, we should check the Preview Recovery Areas box. At the default value of 0, we don't see much, just the edges of the qualification we've pulled for the effect itself. As I drag the recovery amount slider up, you'll notice that we get white specks and regions growing over our image. These white regions are another form of qualification, one that excludes the regions underneath from the smoothing effect. The slider will look for discrete, high-contrast features and try to cut them out of the original skin smoothing. So things like moles, cuts, scars, or other things that are sharp in their detail will be spared the blurring effect, which would look fake on such features. When I bring this up, you can see that the blemish in the right-hand side is brought back and no longer looks artificially brought out, and we can see that we're getting sharpness back in the eyes as well. So if I drag this up a fair amount, you can see there's a kind of textured blemish just here. And if I drag it up, that becomes more obvious. And I'm looking for, there we go, I'm looking for good stuff around the eyes, the eyebrows, edges of the lips, nostril, nose. Those contours are very important. And here we now have some quite nice sharp features which are being emitted from the kind of skin blurring effect, and the whole thing looks a lot more convincing. So now we can take a look at where we were before. And this is a slightly blurred, more matte-looking, idealized version of this actress's skin. And obviously we also have our familiar global blend slider at the end of all this, so we can always tone our look down if we need to. I'm going to leave global blend probably about 0.15 this time, or 0.1. And there we go. I might bring feature recovery down, I might bring my texture threshold down, I might add texture down a little bit, so I keep, sharp eyes, nostrils, lips, but I don't get so much blemish detail over here. So this is an okay beauty grade. In fact, it's pretty good. We'll just take a look at the before and after. Now, it's a subtle thing, but it does make quite a lot of difference, and that's kind of what we're after with beauty work. It's just a kind of a slight little nudge to make things look a little bit more idealized. Now, beauty work is time-consuming and requires a lot of patience. If this all seems a bit fine detail and daunting, then don't worry. It's one of those things that comes with practice. Just remember that less is more. You don't want people to think the on-screen talent is out of focus. This was quite in-depth, so take some time to practice and process this new tool. Remember, this is in-depth stuff and we don't use it all the time, only when necessary or when there is time to do so. The important thing is not to get carried away with tools like this and miss your deadline as a result. Once you've had some practice, click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. The color compressor is a super useful effect for corporate and ad work, where certain colors of uniform, costume, or other products on screen must take the closest possible match to the brand colors provided by the corporate client. So here, I have a color swatch from the client for this video. Now I've got loads of football shirts throughout this edit, as you can see down here. And the red for these shirts is off. This particular client has a very specific shade of red for all their kit, and it's extremely important that this shade of red be reproduced in this video as a result. Now I've got my basic grading done here, but I've got a problem. The red of these football shirts is an off-orange colour, and the shirts themselves vary due to the lighting conditions in the shoot. It's not good enough for a corporate ad like this to have uneven colour in a piece of costume so important to the client's brand. I need to fix the red of this shirt so that it matches the client's brand colours. I can do this with the hue versus hue curves, but there's an easier and much more reliable way to do this, and that is the color compressor effect. Now, the term compress is deeply unattractive in the world of post-production, but this effect does not actually cause any form of lossy compression or image degradation. The color compressor takes all the colors that are qualified in our node and tries to nudge them to be closer to another target color. What this means is that I can tell this node that I want all the values in the off-orange football shirts to be much closer to a value that I can actually define. Can you see the attraction of this yet? We're going to go through how we can actually use this. Now in this node I have a key for the football shirts, and I'm going to apply the color compressor effect to that. So now that I've applied the color compressor to this node, it's only going to act within the regions of this key. I can now use the target color box to define the color that I'm going to push all values towards in this node. So here it says white. I can click on it and then I get a color dialog up here, and I can choose any color I want, hit OK, and then I can actually force things to just turn into that color and nothing else should I want to do so, but that's not what we're going to do with this effect. So when choosing the color I want to use, I have a problem. I cannot use the standard eyedropper to choose a color up here, and the center red on this little still on this swatch is what I want. And if I use the eyedropper to pick from here, it's actually going to pick up the color of the image underneath the reference wipe. I need a way of making sure I get exactly this color into this box here, and I can do that quite easily. What I need to do is I need to bring up the reference still so that this color is visible, and then in the target color box I have here a button called Pick Screen Color, and if I do that I get a little crosshair, and now that will pick up the color of whatever is under that crosshair. It doesn't matter where it is, what part of the image it is, which image it belongs to. I could actually sample colors from my waveform, from my UI down here. I could sample the color of the little green dot here, it'll work. So now I just have to left click on this red here and hit OK, and I now have my target color, the kind of client red color in this box here, and I can now get rid of this reference wipe. This is really important. Pick Screen Color is what you want to use if you're sampling colors from a swatch or from a still of another shot or from the thumbnail of another shot down here, okay? So now that I have my target color picked, I'm going to get to work. I've got 3 sliders here, one for compress hue, one for compress saturation, and the other for compress luma. These sliders measure how close I am nudging all the colors on this image towards my target color, and it's on a 0 to 1 scale, with 0 being staying at the original color value and 1 being forced to adopt the exact same value as the target. So if I compress hue, saturation, and luma, you'll see I'm actually getting a completely flat red color here. I'm actually compressing all the colors and saying, no, you can only be this one value. Now obviously that's too much, so I'm going to have to finesse these sliders to get the football shirt to where I want it. First off, I'm going to work on compress hue. This forces all the pixels in the qualified region of this particular node to become closer or take on a value which is closer to our target color. And what you can notice is that as I drag it further and further along, the overall color of the football shirt changes. So I'm going to go until I'm happy, and I'm going to go for about 0.6, 0.55, 0.6, maybe 0.55. Next is compress saturation, and this actually brings the saturation up to the value held by the target color. Now 1 is obviously too much here, but it's looking a little bit like a lackadaisical down here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this up until I'm happy, maybe 0.18 or maybe 0.16, and now we can already see a really good before and after, and I might just push it a little bit closer. We can already see a really good before and after. Before it was too yellow, a bit orange and off. Now I'm much closer to that very bright, vibrant target color that the client gave me, and that's what makes the color compressor a really powerful effect. I know for a fact I'm getting very mathematically close to a color that I have been given from an external source. So finally, we have compressed luminance, and this makes the pixels take on luminance values closer to the target. It has the unfortunate side effect of killing contrast as you use it. If you homogenize the luminance, you kill contrast, because obviously we perceive contrast in the difference between different values. So I'm going to leave compressed luminance alone, and under most cases I do actually leave compressed luminance alone. I usually make a use of both compress hue and compress saturation. Finally, we have global blend. We know what this does. I can just kind of fade the effect out if I think it's gone too far, but I'm happy with the way this is. So I'm probably going to bring saturation down and hue down a little bit. And here I have my much more accurately red coloured football shirt, and I'm happy with that, and it's dead good. This took, in practice, maybe less than a minute. I just go, right, click, bring this up, pick a screen color, right, thank you very much. Go down here, compress hue, compress sat, look, I'm there. It's a really, really powerful effect for managing bits of costume, key props, key things in the shot which need to maintain very specific colors. Now, one thing that's very important for this effect is that you should not be using it on skin tones. I want to make that absolutely crystal clear right now. It is not a shortcut for working on skin tones, okay? People have a natural variation of hues across the entire body, in the face, in the lips, in the tips of the fingers, on the ears. If all of that becomes the exact same color, it looks unnatural, it looks weird, and it does not look very convincing at all. We've got another lecture on the face refiner later on, in which we're going to go through how to make the most of the subtle variations in hue, especially on the human face. But for now, I just want you to get this into your head. You do not use the color compressor for skin tones, okay? So this has been a really good intro on the color compressor. It's an extremely powerful effect. It is great for props and costume, like I said, just not so much for skin. So we're going to cover more effects next, and click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. Now, this is one for hardcore qualification work. The Alpha Shrink and Grow effect is a plugin designed to fix complex problems with mattes and qualifications that are very, very complex. We'll go through an example of when we might do this. Now, this is one of the more complex operations in grading, and if it seems a bit niche and OTT complicated, don't worry. I don't have to use this effect that often, but when I do, it's for a very good reason. First, we're going to talk about the situation under which you might have to use this effect. We actually have every function present in this effect available in the HSL qualifier. If I click down onto the second page of Matte Finesse down here, we can see that we have a set of operations, and all of these operations are also available in Alpha Shrink and Grow. So what's the point? Well, this plugin lets us act on a combined matte, one we've stitched together with a key mixer node or even an external matte, an alpha channel that was originated outside of Resolve for use during the grade or an online edit. The setup is pretty specific though, so we're going to go through this step by step. So I've got something set up here. I have a complex qualification that combines mattes from two different nodes, and I've done this to try and get a very accurate qualification for the skin of this subject in difficult surroundings. You can see I've got one for the redder tones here on the skin, and then a second one for the yellower tones here, hitting the wood, but also the hair, more importantly. Combined these two keys together using the key mixer node, and the end result I get is okay, but needs a bit of work. I've particularly got some bad gaps up here in the hair, which need fixing before we can continue. So I've gone through and I've done my normal matte finessing down here. You can see I've got clean black and clean white. Now, the important thing is that I should not blur these at the moment. I'm going to apply my blur later on once I've combined them using the Alpha Matte Shrink and Grow. So now that I've combined these two keys together, we're going to use Alpha Shrink and Grow in order to fix the gaps in the hair up here. Now, the first step is actually to make a new corrector node. And I'm going to do something a bit weird. You can see this key mixer is feeding directly into node number 7 up here, which contains the actual skin adjustment, but I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the blue alpha output and I'm going to feed it into the RGB input of this new node. I'm then going to feed the RGB output of this node into the alpha input of node 7. Now look what I have here. I have a node that contains an RGB representation of the alpha channel created through the key. I can actually apply all of my grading tools to this key if I want to. And I can grade an alpha channel in order to further refine the key which I am pulling. Remember, alpha works on black and white. Black is invisible, white is visible. If I grade and make it brighter, it's going to help get rid of some of these gaps up here. That's actually a nice start by itself, but I'm going to do a lot more. So I'll undo that. We can actually grade and pull secondaries on a secondary key if you want, although there's only black and white in there, so there's not much point. But we can actually grade an alpha channel as though it were an RGB image, and this is a very, very useful tool if we're doing some really in-depth and really difficult grading. However, now that this alpha channel is an RGB image within this node, we can also apply effects to it, and to that end, I'm going to apply the Alpha Matte Shrink and Grow effect to the node containing my alpha channel. So now we can start to apply the same set of refinement operations to the combined key. So this qualification has a few small and visible gaps, so I can use alpha shrink and grow to fix these. We have a few options on the slider here, so we'll break them down. And I'm going to do my usual trick of Shift and F to make sure that I can see a full detail image. If I'm going to fix the gaps in this key, I want them to be accurate, so I need to make sure that I can see it in full detail as I'm working. So first we have the operation drop-down menu. This lets us choose how we want to refine our mat. We can choose from shrink, grow, opening and closing, and these all do different things. Shrink will take the operator shape and use it to shrink the white part of the alpha channel down. So I've got operation shrink up here, and if I turn this up, you can see that the key is actually getting smaller. So it functions a little bit like a matte choker from After Effects, but not entirely. Next we have grow, and that does the exact opposite. That makes everything get bigger. It takes the operator shape, circle, square or diamond, and then can grow or shrink the key. Again, not what we want. We then have opening, and opening is going to take these little black spots in the middle of our key and it's going to stretch them out. And you can see as I do that, these black gaps here get a little bit wider. And then finally we have closing. And closing, as you can see, and this is what we're going to use here, closing will actually fill these black gaps in our key right here, and that's what we're going to use to fix this key. So obviously now I'm going to use closing here because there are slight gaps, especially in the upper part of the hair here, that I need to fill. And now I need to choose the operator shape. I have circle, square and diamond. Because this is quite an organic shape, I'm going to choose circle. And most of the time, I've tried different shapes before, but I find that I usually do come back to the circle setting here, because it does help me get kind of organic looking edges when I use the refiner. Next we have two sliders. We have operator radius and repeat operation. Radius adjusts the size of the operator shape, and repeat operation dictates how many different operator shapes we use to grow, shrink, close or open up our mat. So we use these two sliders in unison in order to get the effect that we want. So I'm going to put my operator radius up to 4 and repeat operation up. There we go. Until I just get what I'm after up here. So we're not quite finished yet. We've got a pretty decent looking key. I think if I just keep going up there. I've now fixed most of those gaps around the edge. There's a very slight gap up here, viewed in normal. I might need to add another one of these actually, so what I will do is let's just cut that there. We'll add another corrector. Do the same thing. We're going to add alpha shrink and grow here, but instead of closing, we're going to add grow. And I will just fiddle with that until I get rid of the kind of blue edge on the key here. There we go. We can use this effect multiple times to stack them up and then get really nice refined mats. So the next step is blur. We're going to get another node down here. I'm just going to apply Gaussian blur to that. And I'm just going to dial that up to taste until I get a kind of a nice blurred edge there. Stacking up these effects, and I now have a much better, much more accurate key, which seems to be stable throughout the shot. When we move, okay, we appear to have a little bit of a gap here when she moves her head, so I'm going to go back to the closing operation. I might just... There we go. Problem with the shirt down here. So in that case, in that node, what I will do is I'm just going to garbage that back down, garbage map that out. There we go. And then I think I'm going to have to do the same for the other key as well. Usually like bits of rotoscoping and garbage matting when we there we go. Where is that coming from? Okay, it's probably been brought back. Yeah. Then let's just go ahead and we'll track that. Okay, and then we'll fix that little bit of basic keyframing, number 5. And take that off the edge there so it doesn't get in the way, and we'll do the same for this window up here. It's number 2. Told you this one was in depth. It is just what we find. Cool, and now we have a finished and highly accurate key. Here, let's just watch it through one more time. Okay, we have a little bit of a blip on the edge of the hair there. Let's just... Cool, there we go. So now we've had a very complex key. It's gone through a few different effects operations fed back into the node as well. Now this is a right mess on our node tree, so the final step would be select all of these, and I'm going to make a compound node. But that just sits quite neatly in our node tree, and we now have... Okay, I've spotted one more thing I need to fix, and that's roto out this table back here. So I need to go inside the compound node, see where that table is, which is in here, and I need to do another bit of cleanup with a curve. And I just need to track that table. Cool, there we go. And I'll change the label here just in case. There we are. And now I have a highly accurate key. Should be stable throughout the shot. Going through, checking that. We've got a good key on the skin. And there we go. So that's a lot of work. It takes quite a while. Now, like I said before, if this seems a bit in-depth and weird, do not worry. It is not very common that we have to go this in-depth for a key, especially with like 12-bit footage. If it's been shot well, if it's been lit well, we can key out things fairly easily. This was a, I deliberately set this up to show off this tool. I could have probably gotten most of the work done here with just one good skin key like I did in the practical project. But again, I needed to show you how the alpha shrink and grow effects worked. So that's quite complicated, but don't worry about it too much. We've got one more effect to go through, and then finally it's onto our penultimate practical project. So click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. Now, I know, sharpening is a dirty word in any kind of image manipulation. There are some good sharpening plugins in Resolve though, and every now and again they can be a real help. So we'll take a look at the Sharpening Effects plugin included within Resolve. Of course, we already have a sharpening function present in the blur palette, but it's very primitive and does not give us a great detail of control. The Sharpening Effects plugin is much more nuanced. So first, we'll take a look at the standard sharpen filter. I'm just going to drag it onto a new node here, and then we can start looking at the controls. Now, as I did last time, I'm going to use Shift and F, and then we can take a look at the full screen alongside the effects controls. So this sharpening effect is cool insofar as it breaks the image down into 4 levels of detail that it can work on. This gives us much more control over how we sharpen our image. We have the main slider at the top, which is Sharpen Amount. This dictates how strong the sharpening applied to the image is. It's just like using the Sharpen function in the blur palette, dragging those 3 sliders down. But it's the next 4 sliders that make this effect much more powerful. We have these 4 sliders here, and they dictate to what extent our sharpening function is applied to different details in our image according to their size. These sliders let us tell Resolve that we only want the larger details sharpened. We don't want to give the skin this kind of crazy textured look that we've got going on here. Or conversely, we might want to sharpen only the finer details, and we want to avoid sharpening big details like lips, nostrils, and eyes. So we're going to break this down and take a closer look. So first, we have the Fine Detail Size slider. This decides the overall size threshold of the fine details in the image, things like hair strands, little bits of texture. If we drag this down, it will start to exclude larger details in the image, and if we drag it up, it will start to include larger details in the sharpening operation. It's important to note that this slider has an impact on both the medium and large detail sliders too. When adjusting this slider, you want to be careful and not make the skin look too textured. So I'm going to drag this down a little bit because I don't really want the fine details to be here. Next, we have the sized detail sliders. These all dictate the level of sharpening applied to different details of different sizes according to the value of the fine detail slider. Now that sounds complicated at first, but think of it like this. Any detail below the size indicated by the value on the fine detail slider will then be acted on by the fine details slider, which is this here. And if I drag this up, you can see all the fine details getting much sharper and much more accentuated. Then any details a little larger will be acted on by the medium detail slider, and I can use this here and you can see the effect that has. And then any larger still will be acted on by the large detail slider. And considering that most of this, and that is not a good look, if we drag it right up to the max, that looks a bit nightmarish. But we'll take this down to about 40, and then we can just bring this right down. There we go, and then maybe bring the large details up a little bit. Using these 4 sliders in unison, we can choose just to sharpen the larger details like eyes and facial features very slightly, whilst not making the skin look like sandpaper. Each of these sliders dictates the level of sharpening applied to details of the relevant size. Now these sliders all start at the value of 1, which means our sharpen amount value is applied directly to the details governed by the slider. Because of this, the most effective way to use this tool is to choose a relatively low sharpen amount value and then dial it in to taste with the 4 detail sliders. Think of the detail sliders as multipliers. At the default value of 1, we have all of our sharpening applied. So if we make these values higher, the sharpening gets more intense for the details governed by those sliders. This means we can apply significant levels of sharpening with great accuracy. It all sounds complicated, but just remember to choose a low sharpening amount and then use the detail sliders to amplify that and accurately apply your sharpening. So for example in here, I'm going to set my sharpen amount to about 0.12 or 1.12, and I'm then going to bring my large details up just a little bit. In fact, I'll make it 0.5, 0.05. And then I can bring my large details up very slightly to like 0.06. That's still quite heavy. Fine details has gone crazy. Maybe 0.04. And there I have some of the more accentuated detail on the face here being sharpened. The eyes are sharpened, the nose is sharpened, that kind of thing. And I've left the other fine details and the medium details alone because I don't want to sharpen the skin pores because that always looks awful. So there we have a nice little bit of sharpening. It's very slight, but it's also very accurate, and it's much more accurate than just using blur and sharpen in the blur panel. Finally, we have the Sharpen Chroma slider, and this is going to sharpen the colour of the image independent of its contrast or luma. It's an odd one. I've never found much use for it, but it can be used to make a kind of creative chromatic aberration effect. It can be useful in certain cases, when maybe you've got very odd lighting, or maybe you just want to sharpen up the colour a little bit for a kind of stylized effect, but I don't use it a great deal. So this has been a decent overview of the Sharpening Effects plugin. It's good for a final touch if something just needs a little pop, but just remember, sharpening is an art of subtlety. Don't go overboard like this. Or you're going to end up with an image that has so much detail in it, it almost hurts to look at it. Less is always more with sharpening. So now that we've covered this, we're going to cover our final effect in this module, and that's the grain effect. So click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. We're at the end of the Advanced Node Tree module now, and I thought we'd round it out with an easy, fun effect. Film grain. Yeah, we can add filmic grain directly in Resolve without the use of scans or third-party plugins. Now, scans of actual film grain always produce the best end result, but they're also not free in most cases. The film grain effect in Resolve will let us simulate the effect of different film stocks and easily apply that to our project. Now, because we typically want the film grain to be consistent throughout, one of the best places to apply it is in a corrector node in the Timeline workspace accessed from the drop-down menu in the top right of the node tree. So here I'm in Clip, I'm going to go to Timeline, and now I'm going to make myself a new corrector node up here. As long as I'm working in the Timeline workspace up here, what I do is going to hit every single clip at the same time, hence why I'm going to apply film grain here. I want it to be, pretty much the same across the entire project. This is justifiable for shorter projects. For longer projects and projects with more varied and extreme lighting conditions, you are going to want to apply it in group and make sure that everything is matching together within the scene. It could well be that the film grain settings you have for a scene which is lit very darkly like this are not correct for a scene with much brighter lighting, and vice versa. So first I'm going to apply the film grain effect. I'm just going to drag it onto the node as per usual, and here I have my controls, and I'm just going to go into full viewer mode. Here we go. So here I can see the full effect of the film grain at the time applying. So first we can choose from a selection of presets, and these are a great place to start. With fine grain, we don't really perceive the finest details, the real differences between different stocks. The average viewer doesn't really notice that. So it's fine for us to start from something pre-made and then dial in the strength of that later on. So I'm going to go up here, and I like 35mm. I'll pick 35mm film for this one. Now after that we have opacity, which dictates how visible the grain actually is, with 0 being invisible, 1 being as visible as possible. If we check the grain only box, we can actually see the layer of grain which is being used. We can actually see the layer of grain which is being used for our overlay. And now we have a big set of grain parameters. So these sliders let us make adjustments to the grain layer itself. So for example, if I put grain only up here, you can actually see the difference all of this is having. The texture slider will change how complex our noise appears to be, and this is counterintuitive, however, as higher values produce simpler textures. So if I take a look at this and I drag it right up, you can see I get this weird frog spawn kind of weird cellular kind of structure, and if I drag it down, you can see I get a much grainier, much more tactile, organic kind of a structure there. And it's basically like the scale. You can see I'm almost zooming in to this pattern. So from 0.7 is a bit kind of cellular for me. I'm going to bring it down to about 0.3, 0.35, 0.375. About there. Next we have grain size, and this is unsurprisingly going to adjust the size of the film layer. Now this is just a zoom in, zoom out. Whereas texture is still having an effect of the complexity of the texture of the film grain. This is literally zoom in, zoom out. I don't want it to be like that because then that implies a very small film cell, so I'm going to make it reasonably, probably down to about 0.55 is okay for this one. Then we have grain aspect ratio. After that we have grain aspect ratio. This will stretch our grain out across the x-axis when we drag to the right and squeeze it in as we drag to the left. So I can change the aspect ratio of my grain depending on whether or not I have something that's, 16 by 9, cinema scope, that kind of thing. Right now, I'm just going to leave it at its default value. I don't need to play around with this. After that we have offset. Now this one is just like the offset wheel from our primary wheels. It will make the grain layer uniformly darker or brighter. Left is darker, and right is brighter. Because we have quite a dark image here, I'm going to drag, that's symmetry, that's the wrong one. Because we have quite a dark image here, I'm going to drag my offset ever so slightly to the right, and this will help the grain become a little bit more visible under these circumstances. So I'm just going to bring it up to maybe 0.54, just a little bit, not too much, because I don't want grain to be distracting. Cool. Then we have symmetry. This one affects brightness, but it does so in an odd way. It will shift the image either above or below 50% brightness according to our Luma waveform. This has the effect of squeezing the contrast ratio of the film grain together towards either the brighter or the darker values. If you find that dark or bright values are an issue in your grain overlay, this control can calm those annoying details down. So let's say, for example, the darker grain here isn't going to have much of an effect. With symmetry, I can kind of push the whole thing towards the brighter end of the spectrum a little bit, hoping then afterwards I'm going to get more of a visible effect for my film grain overlay, and I can come back and play with this later on. So let's say 0.65 for symmetry here. Then there's grain softness. This is just blur for the film grain. Easy to understand, easy to use. I drag softness up and blur it out, not very good, and then it's full sharpness. I'm going to reset that. I'm going to leave that at about 0.3 there. I think that's just about right. And finally, we have saturation. Now, by default, the grain is black and white because that's the effect we get with the actual grain of film, that kind of silver crystals effect that we get. But if we turn the saturation up to give us coloured noise, we get the kind of television noise effect where we have multicoloured grains. And if I turn that up, you start to see, red, green, blue, and this looks a bit more like TV noise to me. I happen to prefer the effect film grain gives us when it stays black and white, so I'm going to leave this at 0 for now. Now, to finish this off, we also have our advanced controls, and the names of these can be deceiving. I need to undo grain only here, and then go back. You can now see the effect the grain is having. If I turn it off versus turn it on, you can see I get a much stronger effect now because I've made the grain a lot brighter. You can actually see it much more effectively. But we're going to play around with the advanced controls here and get it just so. So we have 3 sliders here, and initially these can be a little bit deceiving. These sliders actually allow us to define how much of an impact our film grain layer has on different parts of our tonal range. The shadows, mids, and highlight sliders represent the strength of the composite on each of these 3 regions of our tonal range. That is to say, if I drag my shadow slider up to the right, the film grain layer has more effect in the shadows of our image. It does not make the grain layer itself darker or brighter. And if I drag detail highlights down, our film grain layer has less effect on the highlights. And if I drag midtones up, you can see the film grain's having a much stronger or a much weaker effect on the midtones. Now, because we have quite a dark image here, I'm going to bring my shadows up to maybe about 0.6, 0.65, just so I do get a little bit of nice grainy detail back here in the background. So using all these together, I can fine-tune the impact of the grain on my image. If I'm finding that it's too visible in a certain place because of the lighting, I can go in here and I can play around with them. Which is why, really, you should be sorting out film grain on a scene-by-scene or a lighting setup-by-lighting setup basis, not for the entire project. Because this is a relatively short and simple project, that is absolutely fine. In longer projects with multiple different scenes, multiple different locations, lighting setups, you should be applying your grain on a scene-by-scene basis, okay? So this has been a good overview of the film grain effect, and it's a nice way to round out an intensive module with an easier effect. We're going to put it all together now by moving on to our penultimate practical project, so click on through once you're ready.